All right, folks. So it's 11:45. A bit of a sparse crowd, but I suspect it has to do with a couple of things. Number one, our noontime lecture is during the Regional Studies program. So those who had class, a lot of them just left the building and went home to do work. I'm sure they're doing their homework. And then others are just coming for class later this afternoon. And the other thing, too, is that this particular lecture and the crisis in Venezuela, we did announce on very short notice. So with that, what I'd like to do is talk to you today a little bit about the crisis in Zimbabwe, the current situation. If you've got a question anytime, please ask it. The situation in Zimbabwe is quite complicated. I could go back to the colonial era and talk about the Ian Smith government, and we could stay here all day talking about it. What I'll try to do is run through some of the highlights and help you understand how we got to where we're at today. In some respects, this current crisis is a slow-rolling crisis. It's been arguably going on since about 2000, when the farm invasions took place, and the subsequent events that have happened since then have all been tied to those and played off of that. So for those who may not be aware, on the 12th of January, the current president of Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, announced that the fuel prices in Zimbabwe, which are set by the state, would be increased by 150%, which in effect made the price of petrol or gasoline the most expensive of any country in the world. Of course, it's a country where people are desperately poor in many cases, in fact, the majority of cases these days. And so this put a very serious burden on people in the country. There's already a liquidity shortage with hard currency. The economy, since 2009, has relied on the US dollar as its currency, and the South African rand to a lesser extent. This was a consequence of rampant inflation, which saw $10 trillion Zimbabwe notes printed at one time. In fact, there were so many notes printed by the government of Zimbabwe, the Treasury, that they ran out of ink and could only print on one side. And so, with inflation running at trillions of percent annually, an annual rate, they decided to scrap the currency in 2009, and they relied on the US dollar. Of course, this has its own problems. They don't print dollars, so in order to have dollars, they have to come into the country. One of the problems they created initially out of this is that their currency controls probably could have been a little bit tighter. So for instance, in Zimbabwe, after they switched to the dollar as the basis for exchange, people were still allowed to export money. You could go to MoneyGram or Western Union, or you could transfer money from a bank. So a lot of the money that came into the country was transferred out electronically or carried out of the country and went to other places at some point, which didn't help with the currency situation. Shortage of specie, the actual paper. The other thing, of course, is since Zimbabwe can't print the money, those bills get tarnished very quickly. That supply is not replenished. Much like when I lived in Liberia, US dollars were quite degraded and nasty looking after a period of time, and difficult sometimes to even read the amounts on the bills at times. Of course, they're not using coins, so the lowest unit of denomination is $1. So of course, what happens to prices? Either you have to bargain or everything costs $1 or more. And so this is another problem for it. So in 2016, what happened was that the government decided to start making a move towards reinstating their own currency, the Zimbabwe dollar, which had been discontinued in 2009. So they started issuing these bond notes that had the backing of the government, and in theory were backed by hard currency reserves, dollars or rand in their bank. But in reality, they were effectively printing money, and the confidence in those notes has degraded over time. And as a consequence of the election that took place just this past summer, which was disputed, and then the price hike that took place recently, things have kind of spiraled out of control. Moments after announcing that the price of fuel would increase by 150%, President Mnangagwa went on a trip to Eastern Europe, to Russia, to a few of the different stands in Belarus, to drum up investment for Zimbabwe. While he was out of the country, things spiraled a little bit out of control. So with that, let me just cover a few of these key events in the history of Zimbabwe. So the current country we know as Zimbabwe, of course, has been known by several names over the years. But what happened is that in the 1830s, the Ndebele people, who are originally part of the Zulu group from South Africa, fled a large conflict in which the Zulu Empire was growing and was created, known as the Mfecane. And that group, led by King Mzilikazi, fled from South Africa into what is modern-day Zimbabwe, where they came in conflict with the peoples who were already there, the Shona. And so that's the 1830s. By the 1890s, Europeans started arriving in what is modern-day Zimbabwe. And you had the pioneer column of European settlers who come in 1890. And shortly after that, the Ndebele, who had fled from South Africa, engaged in a conflict with the white settlers. So this area, which was sponsored by Cecil Rhodes, became known as Zimbabwe until 1922, and then 1922 became a crown colony, and that lasted until 1965. But before 65, I should digress a little bit here. In the 1950s, after the Second World War, as the Brits started moving towards ending the colonial era in Africa, one of the things they did is they formed a confederation. What we know as Zimbabwe today at the time was known as Southern Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, and then Northern Rhodesia, which we know today as Zambia, and then Nyasaland, or Malawi today. And so there was a brief confederation which lasted for a decade, and then that broke apart. While this was happening, the government in Rhodesia, which was a minority government, which excluded black Africans from many property rights and political rights in the country, sought to have independence from the Brits. But the Brits were not listening to that. They were trying to transition to a majority rule. And so in 1965, the government of the Rhodesian Front, under Ian Smith, declared Unilateral Declaration of Independence, or UDI. When they did that, they embarked on their own independence. It was roundly criticized around the world, and for about the next 14 years, they fought, at some point shortly after that, there arose two nationalist movements to fight a guerrilla campaign against them. Now, those movements predated the independence, or the UDI, but those independence movements fought a guerrilla bush war from 1965 until about 1979. In 1980, after the Lancaster House Agreement in the United Kingdom, Thatcher's government sponsors a conference in which the leaders of ZANU and ZAPU, that's the Zimbabwe African National Union, and Zimbabwe African People's Union, those two groups under Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo are brought to the table along with the black government of Zimbabwe Rhodesia, which was called briefly, and Ian Smith's government. And they sit down and they discuss this, and agreement is reached. So Zimbabwe is to get its independence. There'll be elections in 1980, and the land issue is discussed, and there are a few guarantees put in place. So for instance, in 1980, the white minority is guaranteed they'll have 20 seats in the parliament for 8 years. After that, the Constitution can be amended, and that promise will no longer be there. Also, there was a program of willing buyer, willing seller, in which the government of the United Kingdom promised to provide funds to the Zimbabwean government to purchase farmland or land from willing sellers with those funds to distribute to the poor and to war veterans who fought the campaign. So that's 1980. So from 1980, ZANU, Zimbabwe African National Union, under Robert Mugabe wins the election, rather significant margin, and they become the ruling party in Zimbabwe. So from I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. There's events that take place, but just to wrap this a little encapsulation here. In 1980, Mugabe becomes prime minister. This lasts until 87, when they come up with a new constitution. Legitimate process, new constitution takes place, becomes a republic, still has a parliament, and Mugabe becomes president, federal president. So he rules from 1980 until 2017, when he's deposed in a coup by the Zimbabwe Defense Forces under General Chiwenga. I mentioned the farm invasions. Let me just jump ahead a little bit here. Did you have a question from earlier? Did you want to? Okay. So let me jump ahead a little bit here to the current situation. So we'll jump to 2017. In November 2017, what happens is that there's growing discontent in Zimbabwe inside the ruling party, which now is known as ZANU-PF. In the mid-1980s, those two parties, ZANU and ZAPU, were merged after events that happened in Matabeleland from 1983 to 87. So the parties were merged and became ZANU-PF, or ZANU Patriotic Front, Popular Front. And so that's the ruling party that's been in power since the mid-1980s under Mugabe until late 2017. As Mugabe aged, he was 93 when these events took place. As he aged, it became more and more apparent to members of his political party that his grip on the control of the government was waning and that it was perhaps time for the old man to go. So two competing factions, there had been a previous one that largely been sidelined, but there were two competing factions at this time. One known as G40, which was a group that supported Mugabe's younger wife, who's about 30 years younger than him. And she was trying to amass power and get control for herself, and in effect, in some respects, turn into a dynastic transition from Mugabe to his spouse. And then the other faction under the vice president, who was deposed in November 2017 and flees to South Africa, and that's Emmerson Mnangagwa. And that faction is known as Team Lacoste. He's known as Team Lacoste because his nickname is the Crocodile. Of course, the emblem for Lacoste is the crocodile. So those two factions, there's some infighting. Mnangagwa flees to South Africa, and he seeks political asylum. While he's in South Africa, General Constantine Chiwenga, who's commander of the Zimbabwe Defense Force, is on a visit to Beijing. where he's meeting with Chinese officials. He comes back. Shortly after that, the military leaves the barracks. We hear that Mugabe is under house arrest, and a military coup takes place. The government denies it's a military coup. The military denies it's a military coup. Without a doubt, it's the first military coup in southern Africa that anyone can remember. So Mugabe is sent into retirement. And then the army, or the military, brings Mnangagwa back from South Africa. He comes back. He is installed as president, an extra-legal process not covered under the Constitution of Zimbabwe, and he becomes president. In the meantime, Mugabe's wife's faction is quickly marginalized. There are some sensational announcements of court cases in which members are accused of corruption. Of course, all the people being accused of corruption are supporters of Grace Mugabe, not supporters of Mnangagwa. So those people are charged with corruption, some of them arrested, and a lot of the senior members that are allied to Grace Mugabe try to get out of the country. So this takes place. There's efforts to move money. Grace Mugabe's famously had a convoy of expensive cars which fled through Botswana and ran into cattle. The police stopped them after a traffic accident, and it was discovered they had half a dozen cars, each in excess of about $150,000 in value. Very expensive cars. So things like that were taking place. So the G40 faction was marginalized. Mnangagwa rises in ascendancy, but the reality is that he's backed by the Zimbabwe Defense Force. That's the source of his power. So he becomes president in late 2017 November. He immediately goes on a charm offensive and visits neighboring states, South Africa, Namibia, Angola, and he says that this is a new day, essentially. That what's happened in the past is no longer going to be the case. We're going to have honest governance here, respect for the rule of law. He very popularly announces that the farm invasions were a mistake. It was wrong that the property were taken from commercial farmers that took place from about 2000 to 2008 or 2009, and that it's possible for some farmers to get their land back. This is later disputed, but very famously, a couple of commercial farmers actually have their property returned to them. In addition to that, he gets a lot of attention. He goes to Davos in early 2018, where he's feted, and he talks about reform for Zimbabwe and seeks foreign direct investment, and things are looking bright. He also promises from the very beginning that the elections, which were scheduled for 2018, would take place. There were supposed to be national elections, so he announced that those elections would in fact take place. And so things are looking, in some respects, a little bit rosy for Zimbabwe in early 2018. So the elections are announced in February 14th of last year, on Valentine's Day. The main opposition member, the head of the Movement for Democratic Change, Morgan Tsvangirai, who was a unionist who created this party back in the late 1990s, died of cancer at the age of 65 on Valentine's Day last year. And his party was in a bit of turmoil, in particular because of that, but there were already some issues internally with his party. So when he died, it was unclear if the Movement for Democratic Change could even compete effectively for the election. So we move forward, the election, the campaign cycle takes place. We get to July, the elections take place, and then the results are held up for several days. People are concerned about this, the press is talking about it incessantly, and eventually the election results are announced, and ZANU-PF, which has traditionally retained power in the parliament, increased its lead to 2/3 so that it could amend the Constitution. It's just funny that it works out almost exactly 2/3 their members in the parliament. And then Mnangagwa, the results of the presidential results are not announced for several days. There's anger about this in the press. Eventually the results are announced, and then the Movement for Democratic Change protests in the streets. The military shoots at the protesters and kills 6 Zimbabweans. Now, in December of this past year, there was an investigation was released by one of the former presidents of South Africa, and that investigation identified the military as being complicit and responsible for these deaths. No action has been taken on that to date, but that report that was investigated. So the fact that the commission was appointed, the fact that the president condemned the shootings, and we went forward was very different than the way things have happened in the past in Zimbabwe. So there was a lot of confidence that the country might have turned a corner, even though the elections in the summer of 2018 were disputed. Nonetheless, a lot of people had confidence and hope that Zimbabwe was going to go somewhere else. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that Emmerson Mnangagwa was part of the struggle from the very beginning, the liberation struggle in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and he has been in the government of ZANU since independence in 1980. In one form or another, he's been a minister of this, a minister of that, a member of parliament the entire time, until he was removed as vice president and went into exile briefly for a couple of weeks in South Africa. And I didn't cover some of the aspects of this He accused members of the G40 faction of trying to assassinate him by poisoning ice cream. There's all sorts of subterfuge going on back in November of 2017. So a lot of folks inside Zimbabwe and outside Zimbabwe had high expectations and high hopes that things had changed, that they would improve under Mnangagwa. But unfortunately, here in January, the government announces a fuel price increase on the 12th of January, which, as I said, raises the price of petrol or gasoline to the highest price on the planet. As a consequence, people are unhappy. The trade unions call for a nationwide strike, and demonstrators come out and protest the next 3 days. Over the course of the next couple of days, at least 12 people were shot and killed by security forces, police and military. And then the police and military started going through the cities and rounding up suspected opposition members and imprisoning them. And then many of them, to this point, at least 1,200 people that we're aware of have been arrested. The government then shut down the internet because people were reporting what was happening in the country over their mobile telephones and over the internet. And then when they shut down the internet, they realized that they were still getting data out through the mobile networks. So they told the largest mobile network provider, which is a private company, they gave them a cease and desist order, which forced them to shut down the mobile services, the data that goes along with that. The intent was to shut down applications like WhatsApp, BlackBerry Messenger, things like that, which was the main means people were getting data out of there. So that's taking place, and all the while, President Mnangagwa is on his tour of Eastern Europe trying to raise money while the country is descending into a bit of a chaos. Now, this is out of date already. As I mentioned, at least 12 people have been killed, and over 70 or 80 have been wounded that we're aware of. It's difficult to get actual figures because of the government controlling the internet. It's been turned back on, it's been turned back off several times since this first took place a couple weeks ago. Econet's the largest provider. They're the ones that shut down text message initially. Last week, the government shut down public transportation, which is the primary means for people to get from one place to another, particularly in the capital, Harare, but also in Bulawayo, and some of the other smaller urban settlements like Masvingo in the center of the country. So now what's happened is that a couple of days ago, the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has asked or called on the world to lift sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. Now, this is a contentious point about the sanctions that the U.S. has in Zimbabwe, which have been around for about 15 years now, 16 years, are sanctions on senior members of the party and security officials and a small number of state-owned enterprises. There are no sanctions on the people of Zimbabwe. If you want to invest in Zimbabwe, you can go there as a private investor. You won't face any consequences legally here in the United States. But these sanctions exist. And for many years, the Mugabe government, and since then the Mnangagwa government, have used it as an excuse to blame the macroeconomic failures that have taken place in Zimbabwe on the sanctions. But in fact, the sanctions honestly have had very little impact on the average Zimbabwean. Some people dispute this. I was contacted recently by someone from Zimbabwe that said I was mistaken. I don't live in Zimbabwe, that these sanctions do in fact impact the average Zimbabwean. He gave me an example. He said that he tried to import some bull semen from the United States last year, and he was told he couldn't do it because it's against the law because there's sanctions on Zimbabwe. But in fact, if you look at the legislation or the executive order that's in place, there's no mention of that. So this is, in fact, this may be a situation where the impression of sanctions, the perception of it, is having an impact, but it shouldn't. People need to not be lazy and actually see what the situation is. So that's one example of how perhaps potentially it could be impacting individuals. But in essence, these sanctions are travel restrictions and financial restrictions. So if Robert Mugabe would like to go to Harrods, because the UK has similar sanctions, he can't simply travel there on vacation and go to Harrods and go shopping. So it limits him and senior members of the party who have been implicated or are complicit in human rights violations and abrogation of the rule of law. But the sanctions is a contentious point. So Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, who came to power a little over a year ago himself, as he was formerly the vice president, Cyril Ramaphosa in Davos at the World Economic Forum asked for the world to lift the sanctions in Zimbabwe, saying that the situation is very serious. In fact, it is very serious in Zimbabwe, the economic situation and the political situation. But lifting the sanctions would arguably have marginal impact on the average Zimbabwean at this point. Now, just 2 days ago, officials in the government, ZANU-PF, the ruling party, stated publicly through the press, through government media, and all through press releases that there are members of ZANU-PF who are defying President Mnangagwa and are responsible in part for the oppression and the suppression that's going on for individuals in Zimbabwe. Now, this is a bit odd because, at one hand, The government of Zimbabwe is denying that the military and the security forces are suppressing the population. And then on the other hand, they're admitting that this is happening, but it's not something the president controls. Whatever the case is, it should be very disturbing that these events are taking place and either the president doesn't have control or is unwilling to get control of what's going on here. So yesterday, a number of lawyers in Harare, the capital, marched to the Constitutional Court to protest the unlawful detention and imprisonment of these hundreds of people, many of whom have yet to be charged with any crimes. And some who were marched into court, charged with a crime and convicted within minutes and sent to prison, back to prison. So the leader of the opposition, yes, sir. He is the head of the party, ZANU-PF, that's correct, and he is the president of the country. There have been some recent reports in the last day or two from members of the government who purport to represent the government, claiming that there are members within his party who are subverting his rule. So a similar situation took place when Mnangagwa came to power in late 2017, when you had these two factions. There was this ongoing battle, which I didn't spend much time discussing, inside of ZANU-PF, in which Grace Mugabe's faction was fighting for ascendancy against Mnangagwa's faction. Mugabe sacked Mnangagwa, and that's when he fled the country after he claimed that they attempted to assassinate him with ice cream. He fled to South Africa and sought political asylum. So briefly, it appeared as if Grace Mugabe's faction had reached the pinnacle and would take over the government. So what is happening now is government spokesmen are saying that without identifying any faction or anyone responsible, that something similar may be taking place and that the president isn't able to control these forces because people are subverting his authority.
Where does the ZDF fall in?
Well, they are arguably the kingmaker. It is the ZDF that brought Mnangagwa back after he'd been dismissed from the government and was living in exile in South Africa. They brought him back and installed him as president. And as I mentioned, General Chiwenga, who was the commander of the ZDF at the time, had a trip to Beijing, came back from that. The coup takes place. Chiwenga, after the elections, after the coup, becomes the vice president of Zimbabwe. So he's now the vice president. When the elections took place last summer here in the Northern Hemisphere, it was wintertime in Southern Africa. When the elections took place last July and 6 protesters or demonstrators were killed by the military, there was a lot of tension privately between Mnangagwa and Chiwenga, because Mnangagwa, by all accounts, was very unhappy that this new dawn was being disturbed by security forces shooting demonstrators. So there has reportedly been a great deal of tension between the security forces and Mnangagwa. But the hazard here for Mnangagwa is that he owes his position arguably to the Zimbabwe Defense Force. Without the Zimbabwe Defense Force, he's unlikely to be the president of the country right now. Probably would never have been able to come back in 2017. And if things had gone differently, either Grace Mugabe would have become president, or we would have had some sort of internal strife, or perhaps even bloodletting within the ruling party. So, does that help?
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. So the opposition party leader, it's Nelson Chamisa. He's the person who arrived on the scene and became the president after the death of Shangvarai last year in February. And he's the one that stood for office against Mnangagwa in the elections. He says at least 43 members of the MDC are in hiding from the government, and 5 members of parliament have been arrested and put in prison without charges. Now think about this. If someone marched down to D.C. in the suburbs, leafy suburbs of D.C., and arrested members of the House of Representatives and did not put formal charges against them and put them in prison, we'll probably kind of be up in arms about that, arresting members of our legislature. But that's what's happened. This isn't the first time it's happened. It's happened several times in the past, in addition to members of the opposition having been assassinated in the last decade. So let me show you a couple of videos here very quickly of some of the events taking place. All right, well, I have a video here which shows a private citizen. Now, it's interesting because this was recorded a couple of days ago. Unfortunately, I don't think I'll be able to show it to you. But a couple of days ago, Sky News was purportedly in Zimbabwe. And this video has become very famous in the last 2 days since they aired it on Sky News. And it's purported to show an undercover security officer, a police officer, a military soldier, and another official, unidentified, who arrest a young man, and then they frog march him down the street, and he's not moving fast enough, so they yell at him to start running. The journalist is recording this and speaking and narrating the video as it's occurring from Sky, and then what happens is they must have followed him to a different location. The young man is taken out of this armored vehicle and set on the side of the road, and at that time he's handcuffed, his hands behind his back, and the security officials start beating him, smacking him in the face, and tossing him about, and then dumping him back in the vehicle. And the undercover police officer tells people to get away from the scene. There's some civilians there. So this video was released by Sky News a couple of days ago. The government has come out and said that this is not a legitimate video. Now, what's interesting about this is that the government news release said that this video is not legitimate because it took place 2 years ago. Without realizing, they just admitted that the security forces were abusing people 2 years ago, if in fact this is from 2 years ago. The irony of that seems to be lost on the official who released this. So there's a bit of confusion taking place right now in Zimbabwe with the government, either the spokesman for the president's office or members of the ruling party. In the meantime, the military has been very quiet and has not been speaking to the public for the most part. But as we speak, the government and the police have been rounding up people, going around the houses, and as I said, they've arrested at least 1,200 people and thrown them in prison without any charges. Those that they brought to court have been convicted by and large. Human rights lawyers from Zimbabwe are protesting the situation, trying to get the world's attention to it, and arguing that folks need to intervene. The Southern African Development Community, which is a regional economic community in Southern Africa, has been largely silent on the issue. They said very little about this. It's not unusual. South Africa has been largely silent except for President Ramaphosa asking for the sanctions to be lifted. The African Union has said nothing. I checked their website again yesterday. They've had no statement or news release on this. In the meantime, they've had press releases about Somalia and Mali, but nothing on Zimbabwe. So in the past decade, the most outspoken person to talk about these issues in Zimbabwe had been the president of neighboring Botswana, President Ian Khama, who left office this past year. And so that's a voice that's not there speaking out against events in Zimbabwe. But as of right now, it's difficult to get information. Some of the information coming out is a result of journalists who are in the country or who have gotten in the country and recorded things. Others are a consequence of when the internet restrictions have been lifted briefly. People have gotten information out, either photographs or video, or written news or written emails and sent to people to tell them what's happening in the towns. It's for many people in Zimbabwe quite a frightening situation. The economy is in free fall. It's reported, it's estimated that inflation's roaring once again, currently at 290% per annum. That's a bit of a challenge for most people in Zimbabwe who don't have access to hard currency or anything outside the informal economy in Zimbabwe. So that's where we're at now. Where we go from here is an open question. Without any pressure on the government, it seems unlikely that ZANU-PF will do anything, and so anything that will change the current situation. So many people have asked, why is this happening? Why would the government do this? It's difficult to answer unless the obvious objective is to terrorize the population or to cow the population into behaving. So the one piece I left out of this is when the demonstration started after the fuel price hike, the one sponsored by the trade unions, hundreds of people went out and marched in the streets. Hundreds of people went out and marched in the streets, and some people threw tires in the streets and protested, and the government responded to that. The repression started there. But once the demonstrators in the locations where they were at were dispersed, and the security forces went into people's homes, raided homes around the capital and in Bulawayo as well, and started rounding people up. It's a very difficult situation. But that's where we're at now. Does anyone have any questions so far about anything we've talked about? So here's the problem. So as I mentioned, there's some serious macroeconomic issues in Zimbabwe. There is a serious shortage of hard currency. Now, the government was saying that they were backing these new Zim notes, the bond notes they were issuing, which are supposed to be legal tender, with hard currency. But there isn't sufficient hard currency in their reserves to actually back the amount of money they've been printing, which means people lose confidence in it, which means inflation takes place. And so it's been difficult to raise money to actually import things. Of course, the fuel is coming in the country, either through Mozambique or through South Africa, and the Zimbabwean fuel suppliers have to pay hard currency for that. Because, of course, petroleum is sold in dollars, and those refined products are often sold in dollars. You actually have to have dollars to pay for it. You can't give the Kuwaiti oil company in Mozambique that provides oil through a pipeline Zimbabwean promissory notes. They're not going to accept that. So that's part of the problem. And this is exacerbated, as I mentioned, by a lot of people who have access to currency who are exporting, actually shipping the money out of the country. So every dollar shipped out of the country is a dollar that's not there. They can't print money. But beyond that, they have really undermined the economic situation with the government's decisions on how it manages its economy. And so the reason for the fuel price was to raise hard currency. Because in effect, in reality, with their Zim notes being of little value and less dollars available to buy the fuel, They were expecting fuel suppliers to take the Zim notes, but they can't do much with those. You can't use them outside the country. And so this is what's exacerbated the problem. So they were hoping to raise money by raising the fuel prices. So if you go to fill up your vehicle, you're going to pay it's over $12 a gallon, U.S. gallon, not imperial, but U.S. gallon, for a gallon of gasoline, which is incredibly high. And that money would come back, in theory, back to the state, so they would be able to have hard currency. But the problem is that so few people have their hands on the hard currency right now that people are very angry about that and couldn't fuel. There's two. Well, you've set that up quite well. Thank you, Brian. So that, in fact, is a problem. Part of this is exacerbated, and I haven't really talked about corruption, but one of the problems with what's happened in Zimbabwe since independence, but it's gotten worse and worse since the 2000 farm invasions, is the level of corruption that takes place, official corruption, and then just access to things. So one of the ways that that many commercial farmers, and I'll get back to the fuel in just a moment, but one of the ways that many of the commercial farmers became impoverished is that the government established the government marketing board. And the government marketing board, what that did is for main commodities from the agricultural sector, like maize, which is a staple in Zimbabwe, farmers were required to sell all of their maize to the government marketing board. And who sets the price? The market or the government? The government. So if, for example, let's take an example, period in time, a bushel of maize is $10 Zimbabwean. And the government sets a price $8 Zimbabwean. The marketplace is 10, but you have to sell it to the government for 8. What happens to that $2? It winds up in somebody's pocket. So the government has it. They sell it in the marketplace to consumers. Then the farmers, if they can't produce the maize for less than $8 a bushel, then they've got a problem. And what happens is that they have to go borrow money from a bank to continue operations, to buy fertilizer, to repair their tractors, to pay their taxes, to pay their farm workers. And so that's part of what contributes to the crisis back in 2000. A number of commercial farmers, believing they lived in democracy, became involved in politics, which they had stayed out of largely since 1988, many since 1980. And Robert Mugabe in part saw that as betrayal. And so that contributed to the situation. So back to the fuel. There are members of the government and people connected to the government who are able to buy the fuel at cost. And they are able to ship it outside the country to South Africa and to neighboring Zambia, where they're selling it for 40% markup. And so this is part of the problem too. So this is one of the reasons why the fuel shortage is not just because there's not enough hard currency to buy fuel, but some of the fuel that's there, people are profiteering from it, those who have access. And that's corrupt access. That's not legitimate access. Did I answer your question? Well, I can answer the first question. The second question is a little more difficult. The first question is that the irony is that, so if we go back to 2000, if we take this as a starting point to say that's when this current crisis honestly legitimately started, the genesis of it. So from 2000 to about 2003, 2004, millions of Zimbabweans fled the country because of political violence, assassinations, opposition party supporters being beaten by security forces, and then people who no one who knew who they were. They were likely associated with the government, but they'd show up not in uniform and beat people up or intimidate them or punish them for having voted for the opposition. So millions of Zimbabweans, something in the order of 2.5 to 3 million Zimbabweans are living in South Africa. And a number of them, hundreds of thousands, have fled other places around the world, including the United Kingdom and the United States. So in fact, if you go to Canary Wharf, the big financial sector of London, you can't walk very far around all the major banks without walking into Zimbabweans. Very talented people who know the financial industry very well and make a large contribution to the UK, not to Zimbabwe because they're not there. So the irony is that the economic implosion of Zimbabwe didn't have a major impact on the region. It was mostly felt in Zimbabwe itself because much of what Zimbabwe shipped or produced was shipped out in the form of commodities, either in the shape of diamonds later, but early on agricultural products, which were going, the cut flowers that were produced in Zimbabwe were being shipped to Amsterdam on a daily basis, so wasn't affecting the local economy. And then, of course, the maize did go throughout the region, was also shipped elsewhere, including China and other places. So the South African economy, in many respects, actually benefited. Most Zimbabweans are well-educated through primary and secondary school, are literate and well-mannered and polite for the most part. And so many of them showed up in South Africa with skills, either primary and secondary school education and or university education, and quickly worked themselves into positions of employment in the South African economy. It became very important, particularly in the Johannesburg and Pretoria area. There was a time there I could never go to a restaurant and get good service. I always knew. Once I started getting good service, I'd ask, I said, so you're from Zimbabwe? And the person serving me would be like, they were surprised. They said, how do you know I'm from Zimbabwe? I said, well, because you're very polite and you've provided good service. Because Zimbabweans are like that. It's a very true statement. So in many respects, the economies of the neighboring countries, particularly Zambia, Botswana, and South Africa benefited, especially South Africa. Now, Zambia benefited because the world-famous Victoria Falls, which is in Zimbabwe on the border between Zambia and Zimbabwe, the tourist industry for decades has been on the Zimbabwe side because that's where the best views are. When the farm invasions took place and people were concerned about traveling to Zimbabwe, the Zambians saw an opportunity. And so they started building tourist facilities on the Zambian side. And so they've been able to attract a lot of that tourism that's come there. And so that helps them. Now, the irony for Botswana is Botswana it's a double-edged sword. Botswana has at least a few 100,000 illegal Zimbabweans who've made it into the country, but they're often working the formal sector. And if you go back to 1966 when Botswana became an independent country, you would find that a number of people from Botswana would be working in then Rhodesia as domestics, working as cooks and as chefs and working on farm laborers and such. If you go today and you look for a domestic working in Botswana, I guarantee you almost 100% of the time, the person working as a domestic for someone in Botswana is a Zimbabwean. The tables have turned and the economy is in opposite directions. So the economic impact has been negligible, I would argue, for most of the region. It's mostly been self-inflicted. As far as what our mission's doing, that's a little more complicated and takes some time to answer, so I'm not sure I should really address that one right now. That's okay. Yes, sir, that's speculation, something I'm happy to do. So let me see. Well, first off, there was a lot of people, a lot of diplomats, a lot of analysts, academics, politicians around the world that were puzzled by the African National Congress's response or lack of response to events in Zimbabwe when the farm invasions took place in 2000. And there's a number of factors I would argue that contributed to this. Not one that we can't dismiss that certainly I would say lasted until 2017 is this concept of liberation credentials. So the African National Congress was a liberation movement among many liberation movements in South Africa, but the one that rose to ascendancy and is most associated with the struggle today, rightly or wrongly. I'd say not entirely accurately. There's plenty of others, Pan-African Congress and many others. But the African National Congress sees itself as a liberation party. Still trying to transition to an effective governing party. That's a difficult transition for liberation movements, but they're still undertaking that. And ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe have a reputation for being amongst the most successful and the most devout and those who paid the highest price in the liberation era, in liberating Zimbabwe from a minority rule, from the Rhodesian front, from the minority government in Rhodesia. And so that concept of liberation credentials is something that certainly from 2000 to at least 2015 or 2017 can't be underplayed. That certainly contributed to it. Some respects I would attribute, particularly with Thabo Mbeki when he was president of South Africa, I would say that a lot of what was happening was that the South African government was acquiescing because of liberation credentials. Thabo Mbeki is a technocrat. He spent most of his life in the West, not in Southern Africa during the liberation struggle. And he wasn't a bushfighter, unlike many of the people who are in the African National Congress, or particularly in Zimbabwe, who fought for the struggle. So Mbeki, in some respects, I've always thought, saw himself in a different level than Mugabe. Although he's president of South Africa, a far more powerful and wealthier country, politically, militarily, and economically, especially economically. Nonetheless, the stature of Robert Mugabe as a liberation figure was such that it seemed to me that Mbeki was hesitant to move against him. And of course, the other piece I've mentioned is that I believe that the government of South Africa acquiesced in many respects because South Africa profited immensely from the implosion in Zimbabwe. So because of the difficulties taking place in Zimbabwe, all of this talented labor that came to South Africa and filled jobs. Now that's ironic with the very high unemployment rate. You're saying, why did the South Africans need Zimbabweans? Well, that's a complicated situation in itself. But by and large, those who come from Zimbabwe, as I mentioned, are far better and more productive workers than many South Africans. And so it actually benefited the economy. Beyond that, for supposition and speculation about as to why South Africa has acquiesced, because I would say that's what it is. They have acquiesced by and large. And their acquiescence has really allowed Mugabe to stay in office for such a long time. Also to contort the arguments. So one of the arguments with this whole situation in Zimbabwe going back to 2000 is the land issue. And this is an issue that's coming up again in South Africa. People are talking about land very seriously today in many respects. Particularly with this move to create a constitutional amendment to do expropriation without compensation. So in Zimbabwe, the farm invasions took place in 2000, 20 years after independence. And during this time, the entire time, Mugabe was either prime minister or president of Zimbabwe. Here's the thing. Remember I mentioned early in this presentation that the Lancaster House Agreement in 1979, the agreement was that land could be transferred on a willing buyer, willing seller basis. So there would be no expropriation or confiscation of land from the landowners, which was a pragmatic decision at the time, so that people would agree to a peace agreement and we could move forward. But in those 20 years, very little land was transferred to poor Zimbabweans, and very little land was transferred to war veterans who felt they were owed something for their struggle in the bush. That's a fair argument. So what happens in 2000 after Mugabe, there's a lot of political events take place, but Mugabe had tried to pass a referendum in which essentially all powers, all real power in Zimbabwe would accrue to the chief executive, to the president. So essentially he was trying to make himself a dictator by being able to issue dictates or fiat, to rule by fiat, which would overrule the parliament. Well, this referendum, of course, ZANU-PF, which he had a tight-fisted control over his party, was in favor of. The Movement for Democratic Change, the opposition, which was a brand new party at the time, campaigned successfully against this referendum. And so for the first time in his life, he lost something. He lost an election, and he was quite angry about it. And as he discovered by having his Central Intelligence Organization, this is National Intelligence, which does domestic intelligence as well. And it, by the way, is the same organization that was there during the Rhodesian Front, the Central Intelligence Organization. The CIO and the police quickly discovered that many commercial farmers were supporters of the Movement for Democratic Change. Some actually were registered, open members, and ran for office and got elected in a few places where there was actually a legitimate vote count. But Mugabe felt betrayed by that. And so what happens is that the commercial farmland, they start invading it. But here's the piece that's missing in this. So when this happens, the Western press, African press, politicians around the world are told by the Mugabe government that this land was stolen from Africans when the settler colonists came in 1890. And yes, some of that land, in fact, was stolen by settler colonists who colonized Zimbabwe in the 1890s. But the majority of Zimbabwe's population, white population, European, arrived after the Second World War. Some of them got the land because the government allocated, took it from the majority, black Africans. But from 1980 till 2000, 42% of all commercial farmland in Zimbabwe was sold at least one time. 42%. Now that's the land designated by the government itself as commercial farmland. Every hectare of land, in order to sell it, you had to have the approval of the government ministry under ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe. So from 1980 till 2000, presuming they had the resources to buy the land, they had the ability to buy as much as 42% of the commercial farmland. But 42% of the commercial farmland was not in the hands of the poor or commercial farmers. There were farms in the hands of black Africans from ZANU-PF, from the military, from the security forces, and members of parliament. What happened is that from 1980 to about 1994, the British government followed through on its promise to provide funding to buy these farms and provided something in the order of 63 million British pounds, which I'm not sure what in today's dollars that is, but I'm sure it's probably close to over $100 million at least, to buy the farms. And farms were purchased. But they didn't go to the poor. They didn't go to the war veterans. By and large, they went to connected members of ZANU-PF. And so in the early 1990s, the government of the UK said enough of that, and they suspended that program and quit giving money to them to buy it. So I went kind of far afield. I'm not sure I answered with the speculation, but it was about why other actors would be involved or not involved. I addressed South Africa. What about the Chinese? That's an interesting one. And your point about the Chinese for many years propping up the government of Mugabe is definitely the case, and certainly since 2000, when Zimbabwe had very few friends as a consequence of the farm invasions, and more importantly because of the abrogation of the rule of law. Simply not. When the farm invasions took place, farmers went to the courts and filed court cases and said, look, there's people on my farm, they're wearing military uniforms, the police are standing there watching them destroy my farm and trying to kick me out of my home, and they're not doing anything about it. So they went to the courts, and the judiciary, which at the time was very independent of the government, by and large. These were honest, legitimate members of the judiciary. And there was a mix of black Africans and whites who were in the judiciary. But very quickly, the judiciary would issue opinions. The government would simply ignore them. And when they became tired of getting these opinions, members of the court would find dead pets on their door. Odd traffic accidents would happen, which has long been a method of assassination in Zimbabwe, is traffic accidents. And so the judiciary was quickly cowed. Members retired, were replaced by people who were compliant with what the government wanted, and the judiciary disappeared. So during this time, when that was happening, when the abrogation of the rule of law and the farm invasions were taking place, Zimbabwe had very few friends in the world. Now, there's acquiescence. We could argue from South Africa. I think that's legitimate. China was a friend, and China stuck by. During the 1960s, when Mugabe and ZANU, before the ZANU-PF was ZANU, when they needed support from abroad, they got it in part from the Soviet East Bloc and from China. And so there's long-established ties between Mugabe and ZANU-PF and China, also to a lesser extent to what was East Germany and to the Soviet Union. But to China, those ties have been there for a long time. So from 2000 on, when the Zimbabwe Defense Forces wanted new vehicles, they would get vehicles from China. When they wanted new fighters, they got new fighters from China. The Chinese provided grants and no-interest loans to help keep the government afloat. But arguably, it seems clear that by 2017, with the advanced age and the declining health of Mugabe and this internal power struggle that was taking place, it would seem to me that if the Chinese had an interest here, they were probably wise and realized that there's about to be a very serious power struggle inside the party, which is already taking place, and that they better pick a side and the right side. And if one were to speculate and say that did China get involved, well, if they did, they probably picked the right side because Mnangagwa's faction won. Grace Mugabe's faction has been eliminated as a political threat. They have no power or influence anymore. Now the question is, who's in charge? Is it the military or is it Mnangagwa? Well, since Mnangagwa owes his position to the military, I would argue that the military is really running things in Zimbabwe these days. Can I answer that question? Yes?
My name is Brigadier Mulale from Botswana. EFF President Julius Malema has been very outspoken about the state of affairs in Zimbabwe and has called for the Republic of South Africa, in particular ANC, and the Southern African Development Community to assist Zimbabwe. In the advent of the first and second order effects to neighboring countries, with regards to population migration to neighboring countries, what do you think should be done to provide a long-lasting solution to the recurring wicked political and social economic turmoil in Zimbabwe?
So if I understand your question correctly, Brigadier, Julius Malema, the firebrand leader of the economic freedom fighters in South Africa, has just recently, I think this week, called for the world, South Africa in particular, to help the people of Zimbabwe and intervene. Is that correct? So yes, in fact, he has done that. It's interesting that Malema has done this, but I will point a few things out. Number one, May is an election in South Africa. Julius Malema leads the Economic Freedom Fighters, a party that formed just a short number of years ago, and competed rather successfully in the municipal elections in 2016 and formed a coalition government with the other main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, in Nelson Mandela Bay, which they later left, in Johannesburg and in Pretoria, or Tshwane, the national capital. So one argument, I would say that the Malema is arguably here probably doing a little bit of electioneering, looking for some support, because he's not been clear about what people should do for Zimbabwe. So we should mention this. When the farms were invaded and taken over, many of the people doing this destroyed the irrigation lines on many of these commercial farms, chopped down apple trees and pear trees that were planted, destroyed the greenhouses, burned down the residences of the farm workers who lived in the farms, and did a lot of damage. And then the government divided up many of these farms into odd parcels. So you would have a situation in which a black Zimbabwean is handed a farm, but the farm is a piece of a larger commercial farm, and it's over here in the corner, not connected to an access road, no access to water, no access to electricity, and so basically someone can't even farm the land. So while this is happening, a couple of times since 2000, Zimbabwe's gone through a very serious food insecurity situation. So since 2000, the irony is, despite the relations between the United States and Zimbabwe being rather frosty since 2000, to say the least, the United States has continued to be the single largest donor to Zimbabwe, largely in the form of two things: food, aid. Many Zimbabweans would have starved to death were it not for food from the United States that's been delivered there over the last 15 years or so. And the second thing is our President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, delivering antiretrovirals and HIV services to those infected in Zimbabwe. Without those two programs, there'd be a lot more folks dead. So I've seen nothing from Malema. I saw his statement saying what exactly people should do. Should South Africa provide food relief? Should South Africa do something about, I don't know, taking pallet loads of rands and delivering them to Zimbabwe and putting them in people's bank accounts. That's a crazy solution, but it's something. But he's offered no concrete solutions. So at this point, I would say that he's electioneering and he's looking for attention. If he offers concrete solutions, then perhaps there might be something to it. But I haven't seen that yet. So that'd be my take on Malema. So as we go forward, it remains to be seen what will happen here. It doesn't appear as if SADC is going to say anything, but that's not out of character for them. It's unusual for SADC to act against its member states or to make statements against them. Although, interestingly enough, the SADC, Southern African Development Committee, had a tribunal in which people who lived in the region could take cases to the tribunal if their state was doing something, or a neighboring state. And so a very famous case with Mike Campbell, a commercial farmer in Zimbabwe, and his son-in-law, Ben Freeth. Their farms were invaded. Mike Campbell was beaten severely, suffered severe head trauma, and died prematurely in his 70s several years later as a consequence of the abuse he'd received when his farm was invaded. Ben Freeth went to the SADC tribunal, and they filed a case against the government of Zimbabwe for sponsoring the violence and for taking their property, which they had a deed to, a title. They purchased much of the land after 1980. And the SADC tribunal ruled in their favor and told Mugabe's government to return the land to him. And of course, Mugabe's government simply ignored that. By the same token, in 2008, the opposition party, despite vote rigging and ballot box stuffing and massive voter intimidation, as well as beatings and assassinations of opposition political party members, Mugabe lost the election to Morgan Tsvangirai. Morgan Tsvangirai had a plurality of the vote, but SADC brokered a unity government in which the two parties ruled together because Mugabe simply refused to leave office. Even having lost an election despite massive fraud, they still managed to lose the election to the opposition, yet they simply wouldn't leave office. They stayed in office. And that's the state of Zimbabwe, the situation that's going on there. ZANU-PF, many members of the party seem to feel they're entitled to rule for themselves, and they have no intention of giving up power. Certainly that seems to be the case now with the ZDF as the main power broker in the country. So any other questions? With that, folks, I'd like to thank you for your time. I hope it was instructive and you've got something useful out of it. Thank you for coming today, and hopefully we'll see you for another noontime lecture.